How's it sound? Hello? That's grand.
Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to see you all. First, let me make some necessary thanks to all of the co-sponsors of this event with Michael Longley, to which we have all been longing for. I would like to thank the College of General Studies for their generosity and their support of poetry and all things Irish. I would like to thank the BU Centre for the Humanities, the Institute for the Study of Irish Culture, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, Writers, and Agni Literary Journal for their support. So before we begin with the reading, we have a kind of surprise bonus for you. Paul Wells will be playing an air for us called Parting from Friends. The Parting of Friends. You know, thinking about the loss of one of Michael Longley's great friends, Seamus Heaney, a month and a half ago. Paul Wells is the Director Emeritus of the Center for Popular Music in Middle Tennessee State University. He is a musicologist whose specialty is American music and the traditional music of Ireland. So he'll play one air, and then I will introduce Michael Longley.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here this afternoon and join you for this very special event. I'm going to play a tune. As Meg said, it's a slow air, an traditional Irish air called The Parting of Friends. And I learned this from a recording by the great Matt Malloy, who is perhaps the reigning star of Irish flute playing and has been for a good long time. Some of you may have heard him with the Chieftains, if not as a solo artist. And I learned this from the CD a few years ago, but had not remembered until this morning when I pulled the CD out again to listen again to Matt's wonderful performance, that the notes for the CD were written by none other than Seamus Heaney. So there's a bit of a connection there with the great poet and this air. This is an air that was recorded or collected, written down for the first time in the very late 18th century by Edward Bunting, who was one of the first scholars of Irish music, one of the first great collectors. He worked mostly with harp players in Belfast. The story that goes with this, I guess, was that it was written for Wolfe Tone and played for him and his family at the time he left Ireland for America, if I've got that story straight. Anyway, I'd like to play it for you now, The Parting of Friends.
A list of Michael Longley's awards, accomplishments, and publications would take up all the time I have for an introduction. So let me say briefly that his awards include the Whitbread Prize, the T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize, the Hawthornden Prize, and the Irish Times Irish Literature Prize for Poetry. T.S. Eliot wrote that it is the whole journey, not any one stage of it, that assures the writer his place among the great. Michael Longley, long ago, secured his place among the great. As Langdon Hammer notes, Michael Longley is the pure lyric artist, lucidity, economy, sincerity. Longley strives towards these goals by means of meticulous, unpretentious technique. In Longley's poetry, you will find no long-winded utterances, no flimsy membranes of poems that talk too much and say little. His verse contains syllables that count in more ways than one. The collection of poems that is coming out next year, The Stairwell, delivers to us his customary virtuosity, the intoxicating distillation that takes place when Longley tucks expansive Homeric narratives into English verse forms and introduces to us a sound at once new and familiar, that of lament for his brother. Meter is one thing that often provides a kind of sedative to the excitements of poetry by the co-presence of something regular. The shapes and links of Longley's poems are this something regular that gives the poems a predictable rhythm and provide balance for the distresses of loss, the pipit that fits snugly into the merlin's talons, the fox that startles the ewes and the lambs. Longley's poems are perfect in their kind, and each is an event, as Eliot said that poems should be. What kind of event, diurnal or unusual, can be equally luminous? As Christopher Ricks has observed, it's like the difference between admiring a sunset and admiring a shooting star. I welcome Longley, Michael Longley.
Thank you very much, Meg. And thank you for inviting me here. And Steve Scully, we had a good session with the classicists yesterday afternoon. But there have been numerous emails from Meg, and all of a sudden, here I am. Mention has been made of Seamus Heaney. On the 16th of August, I shared the platform with him in Lisdoon Varna in County Clare, and we had a good session afterwards in Sheedy's hotel, and then 2 weeks later he died. Plato said of the death of Socrates, the sun went down and his friends went on talking. Now, in 2011, Heaney and I were two of a small group of poets who were being honoured by University College Dublin, and there was a posh lunch afterwards, and Seamus leaned and he talked past 2 or 3 people towards me, and he said, "What's the Greek for boat?" And you know the way sometimes you forget your own name? I was supposed to be a translator of Homer, but by God I'd forgotten. I couldn't remember. So I wrote a little squib to kind of ease my embarrassment. and I'll read it now. It's called Boat, for Seamus. What's the Greek for boat, you ask, old friend? Fellow voyager approaching Ithaca. Oh, flatulent sails, wave winnowing oars, shingle scrunching keel. But so close to home, there's a danger always of amnesiac storms, waterlogged words. And just a few days ago, I went to a week or so ago, I went to the grave in Balaki, and a little 6-line poem came to me. It's only 6 lines, and 2 of those are an adaptation of lines from Psalm 91. It's called Psalm. One wreath had blackberry clusters intertwined. Was it a blackbird or wren that briefly sang a graveside aria, godlike in its way, a psalm? He will defend you under his wing. You will be safe under his feathers. And I'll proceed with a group of 3 love poems from different stages of my life. The first is called Swan's Mating. I'll read them together. The first is called Swan's Mating, and it uses 2 lovely English words, cob for the male swan and pen for the female, and it speaks for itself. And then I'll follow that with a poem which is 6 quatrains, and it's called The Linen Industry. And it's a love poem. It's obviously a love poem, and I like to think it has a good erotic charge to it, but it's also a love poem to my native province of Ulster, which was once famous for its linen. And the resolving image in the second poem is the bleach green. And when the material had been woven, it would be laid out in a field, the bleach green, to bleach in the sun, so that at the height of summer it would appear that there'd been a fall of snow. And then the third is a poem about being married a long time. So, Swan's Mating. Even now, I wish that you had been there, sitting beside me on the river bank, the cob and his pen sailing in rhythm until their small heads met and the final heraldic moment dissolved in ripples. This was a marriage and a baptism, a holding of breath, nearly a drowning, wings spread wide for balance where he trod, her feathers full of water, and her neck under the water like a bar of light. The linen industry. Pulling up flax after the blue flowers have fallen, and laying our handfuls in the peaty water to rot those grasses to the bone, or building stooks that recall the skirts of an invisible dancer, we become a part of the linen industry and follow its processes to the grubby town, where fields are compacted into window boxes, and there is little room among the big machines. But even in our attic under the skylight, we make love on a bleach green, the whole meadow draped with material turning white in the sun, as though snow reluctant to melt were our attire. What's passion but a battering of stubborn stalks, then a gentle combing out of fibres like hair, and a weaving of these into christening robes, into garments for a marriage or funeral. Since it's like a bereavement, once the labour's done, to find ourselves last workers in a dying trade. Let flax be our matchmaker, our undertaker, the provider of sheets for whatever the bed. And be shy of your breasts in the presence of death. Say that you look more beautiful in linen, wearing white petticoats, the bow on your bodice, a butterfly attending the embroidered flowers. The pattern. 36 years to the day after our wedding, when a cold, figure-revealing wind blew against you and lifted your veil, I find in its fat envelope the 6-shilling Vogue pattern for your bride's dress, complicated instructions for stitching bodice and skirt, box pleats and hems, tissue paper outlines, semblances of skin which I nervously unfold and hold up in snowlight, for snow has been falling on this windless day, and I glimpse your wedding dress and white shoes outside in the transformed garden, where the clothesline and every twig have been covered. We've been going, Edna and I, with the family to County Mayo since 1970 for 40 years or more, and we go to a little townland called Corrigskewan, which translates, I think, as the Rock of the Wall Fern. It's a very, very remote part of the world. And the name Corrigskewan chimes through my work. And the first poem I'll read is a kind of a failed sonnet. It remembers, I'm sitting in Belfast and I'm remembering a magical day when all sorts of strange things happened. Remembering Corrigskewan. A wintry night, the hearth inhales, and the chimney becomes a windpipe, fluffy with soot and thistledown. A voice box recalling animals, the leveret come of age, snipe at an angle, then the porpoise's demonstration of meaningless smiles. Home is a hollow between the waves, a clump of nettles, feathery winds, and memory no longer than a day, when the animals come back to me from the townland of Corrigskewan, from a page lit by the Milky Way. And two elegies for people from this neck of the woods that meant a great deal to me. The first, a farmer called Joe O'Toole, and I've called the elegy for him Between Hovers. Now, Hovers doesn't appear in the big dictionary I have at home, but you have a holt, which is the otter's home, and you have, or it's den, and you have hovers, which are stopping off places it stops off to eat or to clean itself. The hover, beautiful, beautiful word. Do you want to come in and sit down? And the second poem is for a wonderful man called Charlie Gaffney, who ran a brilliant pub in Lewisburg, the nearest town to us. And Charlie was a man of infinite subtlety and refinement, and always seemed to me that rather than running a pub, he should be the professor of philosophy in some university. But in a way, luckily for me, he ran a very good pub and pulled brilliant pints of Guinness. Now, Charlie kept at the end of his bar a cluster of charity boxes, and one of them was for the lifeboats, and you launched the toy lifeboat with an old penny. That's all you need now. So I'll read these two elegies for much loved men. Between hovers, in memory of Joe O'Toole. And not even when we ran over the Badger did he tell me he had cancer, Joe O'Toole, who was psychic about carburetor and clutch and knew a folk cure for the starter engine. Backing into the dark, we floodlit each hair like a filament of light our lights had put out somewhere between Kinnadui and Talabon. I dragged it by two gritty paws into the ditch. Joe spotted a ruby where the canines touched. His way of seeing me safely across the Dúch was to leave his porch light burning, its sparkle shifting from widgeon to teal on Corrigan Lake. I missed his funeral. Close to the stony roads, he lies in Killeen churchyard over the hill. This morning, on the burial mound at Temple du Mor, encircled by a spring tide, and taking in Clunamana and Clagan and Corrigsky one, the townlands he'd wandered tending cows and sheep. I watched a dying otter gaze right through me at the islands in Clew Bay, as though it were only between hovers and not too far from the Holt. And the lifeboat. I have imagined an ideal death in Charlie Gaffney's pub in Lewisburg. He pulls me the pluperfect pint as I, at the end of the bar, next the charity boxes, expire on my stool, head in hand, without a murmur. I've just helped him to solve his crossword puzzle, and we commune with ancestral photos in the alcove. He doesn't notice that I am dead until closing time, and he sweeps around my feet. But it's Charlie Gaffney who has died. Charlie, how do I buy a fishing license? Shall I let the dog out? Would the fire take another sod? The pub might as well be empty forever now. I launch the toy lifeboat at my elbow with an old penny. And another Mayo poem, this one's called Cayley. Now, the cottage we stay in was built for a family called the O'Tooles, who lived on a little island in Killary Harbour in the ocean called Inishdago. And Mrs. O'Toole had 11 children without a doctor, without midwife, and somehow or other they survived fishing and growing spuds. But life got too much for them, and they were moved to the mainland, to our very remote cottage where we stay now. The O'Tooles that's where they had lived, and because of that family, it was known as a Cayley house. Everyone in of the 13 of them spoke 2 languages, could tell stories, sing songs, and play a musical instrument. So they were highly cultivated, sophisticated people. And people journeyed, walked to the Corrigskeewan cottage for the Cayleys, for the evening's music and stories. And they would come all the way from, some of them would come all the way from Connemara. They would row across the Killary and then walk the further 3/4 of an hour to the cottage just to be there. And I often think of those evenings when I'm there and I'm overwhelmed with imagined memories, if you know what I mean, of the O'Tooles. And this is for them. Joe O'Toole makes an appearance in this poem as well, but he's not related to the Inishdago O'Tooles. Very important to get that right, you know. And I've called it Cayley. A Cayley at Corrigskeewan would now include the ghost of Joe O'Toole at ease on his hummock, the far side of Corrigan Lake, as he listens to the O'Tooles from Inishdago who settled here 80 years ago. 13 O'Tooles, each of them a singer or fiddler, 13 under the one roof, a happy family, but an unlucky one, Joe says. And the visitors from Connemara who have rowed their currachs across the Killary for the music, and my ghost at the Duach's sheep-bitten edge, keeping an eye on the lamps in the windows here, but distracted by the nervy plover that pretends a broken wing, by the long-lived oyster-catcher that calls out behind me from Tullabon Strand. The 13 O'Tooles are singing about everything. Their salty eggs are cherished for miles around. There's a hazel copse near the lake without a name. Dog violets, sorrel, wood spurge are growing there. On Inishdago there's a well of the purest water. Is that Arcturus or a faraway outhouse light? The crescent moon's a coracle for Venus. Look, through the tide and over the Owen Ardonon are shouldered the coffins of the 13 O'Tooles. We were looking at Homer yesterday, and sorry, I have to work out how to. Isn't education a marvelous thing? I want to read 2 versions. The first is called The Campfires, and I think it was, I forget which great poet from the past said this is the most beautiful passage in all poetry. The description of the the campfires on the plain at Troy. And it reminds me when I read it. Excuse me, I'm going to have to sneeze. Because where we go, we're free of, that strange oxymoronic phrase, light pollution. Well, we're free of light pollution. And on a clear night in Carrigskeewan, you can look up into the depths of the Milky Way. And that reminds me of this passage in Homer. And the two come together in my heart to such an extent that I have cheekily inserted into Homer's narrative some local names: Tonakira, Alaran, and Killary. The campfires. All night, crackling campfires boosted their morale as they dozed in no man's land and the killing fields. There were balmy nights, not a breath, constellations resplendent in the sky around a dazzling moon, when a clearance high in the atmosphere unveils the boundlessness of space, and all the stars are out, lighting up hilltops, glens, headlands, vantage points like Tonakira and Alaran, where the tide turns into Killary, where salmon run from the sea, where the shepherd smiles on his luminous townland. That many campfires sparkled in front of Ilium, between the river and the ships, 1,000 fires, round each one 50 men relaxing in the firelight, shuffling next to the chariots, munching shiny oats and barley. Their horses waited for the sunrise. Now, in August '94, as most of you will recall, there were rumours that there was going to be an IRA ceasefire, and I was reading the episode in the Iliad where Priam goes to the tent of Achilles to beg for the body of his son Hector, whom Achilles has killed in combat. And I thought, wouldn't it be marvellous if I could compress this quite long episode into a sonnet and get it into the Irish Times and make my own minuscule contribution to the peace process. And I was able to write a sonnet. It did get into the Irish Times, and what is more, it got into the Irish Times the same week as the IRA declared their ceasefire. So it made me seem much more prescient and politically wise than in fact I am. So I was telling the students yesterday, I've made many political prognostications in my time, and they've all been wrong. So, but this poem has a certain life. Most poems make their space in private. This is one of my poems which made a kind of public space for itself. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father, and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. And I'm obsessed by the World War One. We call it the Great War. I think you call it World War One. And it seems to me that the world is still recovering from it. That we have never got over the huge abomination that it was, and it draws me partly because my own father joined up as a boy soldier in 1914, and miraculously he survived from September 14 through to November 1918. And in the course of surviving, he won the Military Cross for Valor and became a captain before he was 21, a captain in charge of a company of boys, many of whom weren't regular shavers. So I'm going to read two short poems about that. The first one is called Harmonica, and it's my favorite poem, even though it's only of my own, even though it's only 7 lines long. And you need to know about Anaximenes, the early Greek philosopher, who believed that everything, the basis of everything was air. And you see, my father had come home, or I'd come home from school with a mouth organ, a harmonica. My dad picked it up and started to play it. And I'd never heard him play anything before. And I thought it would be marvelous to write a poem about that, but I couldn't do so until years later I was reading about Anaximenes, and he breathed life into the poem. I mentioned a music hall song. That might be, it is for me, it's a long, long way to Tipperary, which I can't hear without feeling tearful. And then the second poem, Pipistrelle, again, it's over before it's begun, so you need to be on your toes. It's about a soldier who lost his skin and was kept alive by loving nurses in a solution of warm salt water. And in the poem, I give him a strange pet, a little bat, a pipistrelle. 309. So we begin with harmonica. Sorry for the delay. Harmonica. A Tommy drops his harmonica in no man's land. My dad, like old Anaximenes, breathes in and out through the holes and reeds and finds this melody. Our souls are air. They hold us together. Listen. A music hall favorite lasts until the end of time. My dad is playing it. His breath contains the world. The wind is playing an orchestra of harmonicas. Pipistrelle. They kept him alive for years in warm water, the soldier who had lost his skin. At night he was visited by the wounded bat he had unfrozen after Passchendaele, locking its heels under his forefinger and whispering into the mousy fur, before letting the pipistrelle flicker above his summery pool and tipple there. He spread the wing hand, elbow to thumb. The membrane felt like a poppy petal. And a new poem called Boy Soldier, thinking partly about my father. But the Boy Soldier I use as a token is from the Iliad, and then I bring in briefly the First World War. So this is a mixture of the Iliad and the Great War. It's a kind of a sonnet. Boy Soldier. The spear point pierces his tender neck. His armor clatters as he hits the ground. Blood soaks his hair, bonny as the graces, braids held in place by gold and silver bands. Think of a smallholder who rears a sapling in a beauty spot a burn burbles through. You can hear the music close to your home. Milky blossoms quivering in the breeze. A spring blizzard blows in from nowhere and uproots it, laying its branches out. Thus Euphorbus, the son of Pantheus, a boy soldier. The London Scottish say, the Inniskillings, the Duke of Wellington's, was killed and despoiled by Menelaus. And I've already mentioned Highwood, but here's a 6-line poem, two of which are from the Iliad, the last two. At Highwood. I picture my gentle dad at Highwood, lying wounded among the splintered trees and unburied dead, some of them his mates, some his victims, shot and bayoneted. Many Trojans and Achaeans fell that day and lay side by side, faces in the mud. And I lost my twin brother. The whole of the next book will be for him, poems about him. There's about 21 of them, and most of them are Homer inflected. They owe something to the Iliad. And I'll read a couple of these. The first is a fairly straightforward translation, and I've worked it as to be 2 14-liners, two sonnets. The Apparition. Are you asleep, Achilles? Have you forgotten me? Bury me quickly, please, and let me through death's gates. Exhausted ghosts get in the way and keep me from crossing the river to join them. A lost soul, I sleepwalk on the wrong side of the gateway. Let me hold your hand. Once you've cremated me, I'll never come back again out of the darkness. Never again will you and I sit down together to make plans at discreet distance from our friends. My birthright, death's abominable night terror, overwhelms me now. Your destiny too is fixed, godlike Achilles. Death below the Trojan walls. One more request. Bury our bones together in the gold two-handled jar your mother gave you. Patroclus, dear brother, I shall do as you ask. I'll see to the arrangements for your funeral. But come closer now. For a moment, let us embrace and wail in excruciating lamentation. He reached out, but he couldn't get hold of him. Like smoke, the hallucination slipped away, bat squeaking underground. Achilles, flabbergasted, threw up his hands and blurted out heart-broken words. Even in the house of death something remains, a ghost or image, but there's no real life in it. All night the apparition of sad Patroclus has hovered over me, weeping and keening and giving instructions. Did I imagine him? He looked so like himself, a double, a twin. And the feet. This is dedicated to my sister-in-law by twins' widow. The feet for Catherine. You showed me my twin's feet when he was dead. Your sailor husband's feet, your engineer's. How cold they felt. How handsome ankle and toe. Bone shapes out of our gloomy womb tangle. A god's immortal feet, I'll dare to think, when we scatter his ashes in the North Sea off the windy pier at Whitburn village. Poseidon, say, who drives his chariots, bronze-hoofed horses, so headlong over the waves. All the sea creatures know who it must be, and the sea parts with a kind of happiness, and the axle doesn't even get wet. And I wanted to celebrate the rough and tumble of having a twin brother. We were rolling around on the floor fighting, so far as I can remember, for most of our shared boyhood. So I took this episode from the funeral games in the Iliad and redid them in a way for my twin, the boxers. We were combatants from the start. Our dad bought us boxing gloves when we were 10. Champions like Euryalus, say, or Epias of wooden horse fame. I am the greatest. Nobody's going to knock me down. Listen, Peter, to the commentary. Gruesome teeth grinding, sweat splattering their arms and legs, huge fists in oxhide thongs slugging it out. Then the knockout blow to Euryalus' chin, hoisting him with an uppercut, like a fish that arches out of weed-tangled shallows and collapses back into hazy water, sea wind sending shock waves up the beach. The winner gives the loser a helping hand, and his seconds support him across the ring on dragging feet, head lolling to one side, blood clots, etc., etc. I'll tie your gloves. Shall we fight again? And what do we do? Here's Peter, my twin, remembered in terms of Corrigskeewan and the west of Ireland and County Mayo. And this was on the 27th of July, our birthday. And I didn't know how I was going to deal with it, my first birthday without my twin. So I dealt with it by writing a poem. And I mentioned choughs. I may not know what choughs are. They're a member of the crow family, a very beautiful, attractive bird. And they have this wonderful call, pshaw, pshaw. I'll read it. The birthday. This is our first birthday without you, my twin, July the 27th. Where are you now? I'm looking out for you. Have you been skinny dipping at a larren where the jellies won't sting, or in the lake among the reeds and damselflies, sandwort stars at your feet, grass of Parnassus in bud? This year the residential swans have cygnets, 4 of them. They won't mind you splashing. Nor will the sandpipers, eyeing Duoctree for a nesting place among the pebbles at the samphire line. Now you know the spot. Choughs flock high up above their acrobatic cliff face and call to you antiquated expletives. Pshaw, pshaw, pshaw. Again and again I mention the erratic boulder because so much happens there. 5 hares in the morning, then a squiggle of stoats. I've boiled organic beetroots for supper. Will your pea be pink in heaven? Oh, the infinite gradations of sunset here. Thank you for visiting Corrigskeewan. Don't twist your ankle in a rabbit hole. I'll carry the torch across the Duach. And I've mentioned Duach 3 or 4 times. It's a kind of flat, sandy plain, which in the Scottish Islands they call the Macher. But I hope you picked up what I was trying to say. And I'll draw to a close with a couple of grandchild poems. My wife said I mustn't become a boring old grandfather. But it's terribly hard not to. You know when you're being boring and you don't actually mind that people think you're being boring. Well, we had our 7th, and I think probably last grandchild, was born on Burns Night last January. And that means that every birthday she's going to have haggis with a candle in it. And this is a poem for her. She's called Amelia. And I mentioned ponies with these lovely names, Silver and Whisper, and the bar in which their hay is kept is a preserved. There's a preservation order out on it. It's a wattle bar made of wattles, and there's a gynecological term of some. A lot of people don't know what it is. Meconium. You know what meconium is, don't you? You don't? Oh, well, it's the first bowel movement of a newly born baby, and it's of tremendous importance, of course. And when it presents itself, you know you've got a healthy baby. And it also bears an extraordinary resemblance to the sprint. You know what a sprint is? It's the excrement of an otter, a sprint. So you've learned 2 really earthy words. Yeah. Meconium. So anyway, this is called Amelia's poem. Amelia, your newborn name combines with the midwife's word, and like smoke from driftwood fires, wafts over the lochside road past the wattle bar, hay bales for ponies, silver and whisper. Between dry stone walls, river-rounded, moss-clad, ferny stones, through the fenceless gate and gorse to the flat, erratic boulder where otters and your mother rest. Sprints black as your meconium, fish bones, fish scales, shitty sequins reflecting what light remains. And thank you for coming this evening. And I realized my reading was slightly somber, but I mean, as you get older, the poetry necessarily becomes more elegiac, because your friends keep dropping off the end of the branch. And I'll end, as I say, thank you for coming. And it's very important now and again to stand up and to read poems aloud to people who want to hear them, because poetry is launched from the mouth and finds its resting place in the air. The Leveret. I should have mentioned too that the Owen or Dunon's the little river. I've already mentioned it a few times. But this is for my first grandson, and on his first visit to Corrigskeewan, the rain had fallen so heavily for so long that the river was in spate, and he had to come in a tractor, a neighbour's tractor. So thank you again, and this will be my closing poem, The Leveret. This is your first night in Corrigskeewan. The Owen or Dunon is so full of rain, you arrived in Paddy Morrison's tractor, a bumpy approach in your father's arms, to the cottage where, all of 1 year ago, you were conceived, a fire seed in the hearth. Did you hear the wind in the fluffy chimney? Do you hear the wind tonight, and the rain, and the shorebird calling from the mussel reefs? Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the sea, little hoplite. Have you been missing it? I'll park your chariot by the Otter's Rock and carry you over seaweed to the sea. There's a tufted duck on David's Lake with her suit full of hatchlings, pom-poms, a day old and already learning to dive. We may meet the stoat near the erratic boulder, a shrew in his mouth, or the merlin meadow pipit hunting. But don't be afraid. The Leveret breakfasts under the fuchsia every morning, and we shall be watching. I have picked wild flowers for you, scabious and centaury, in a jam jar of water that will bend and magnify the daylight. This is your first night in Corrigskeewan. Thank you.